During World War II, you had this incredible, unlikely team-up. Britain, the USA, and the Soviet Union, all joining forces to take down Hitler. And guess what? They won. But here's the real puzzle. Even before the war was officially over, this so-called Grand Alliance was already falling to pieces. So how did the victors of the biggest war in human history turn on each other so fast? Let's dig in and figure out why this powerful partnership might have been doomed right from the very start.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with just how strange this alliance was in the first place, then get into the massive clash of beliefs at its core. We'll see the first cracks show up during the war itself, take a look at how they started planning for a new Europe, and finally trace that journey from allies to, well, enemies.
So first up, let's get one thing straight. This was never about friendship, not even close. The Grand Alliance was a classic marriage of convenience. They came together for one reason, and one reason only. They all needed to defeat their common enemy, Nazi Germany.
You see stuff like this 1941 cartoon, right? It shows Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin arm in arm with this cheesy caption, "Love conquers all." But, this was pure PR. This wasn't the reality. The history books are clear. This was a strategic wartime alliance, not a bond of brotherhood. The real story was a whole lot messier.
Because behind those smiling cartoons, the reality was this massive, unbridgeable gap. On one side, you have the USA, a capitalist democracy totally built around the idea of individual rights. And on the other, the USSR, a communist dictatorship where the state controlled literally everything. These aren't just two different countries. They were two different worlds, operating on completely opposite principles.
And look, this wasn't a fresh start for them. There was a long, ugly history here, a lot of bad blood. For more than 20 years, the West had been openly anti-communist. They'd even backed the enemies of the communists in the past. They were terrified of a Red Scare. And Stalin? He was just as suspicious of them, especially after they tried to appease Hitler in the 1930s. And let's not forget, Stalin's own cynical pact with Hitler in 1939 proved to the West that he couldn't be trusted an inch.
Okay, so that history of mistrust, it leads us right into the heart of the problem. This fundamental clash of ideologies. This is the real reason they were never going to be true partners in the long run.
Just look at this breakdown, side by side. The economy, private property versus state-owned everything, government, free elections versus a one-party dictatorship. Their core values were opposites, individual freedom versus the good of the state. But here's the real kicker, the one that made conflict almost inevitable. Their worldview. The USA's main goal was to stop the spread of communism. The USSR's main goal was to spread it. Their plans for the future of the planet were in direct opposition.
And this wasn't just some dry political disagreement. This was a deep, gut-level fear. Just listen to this from the U.S. Attorney General, all the way back in 1920. He calls communism a prairie fire built on robbery and murder. That kind of intense, almost paranoid language shows you just how terrified of communism the American establishment was, long before World War II ever kicked off. So you've got all this mistrust and fear just bubbling below the surface. It was only a matter of time before the actual pressures of fighting a war together would start to blow some serious cracks in this fragile alliance. First, there was the huge issue of the Second Front. From the end of 1941, Stalin was begging his allies to invade Western Europe to take some of the heat off the Red Army, but they delayed for years. Then, in 1943, the horrifying discovery of the Katyn massacre, where Soviets had murdered thousands of Polish officers, just confirmed the West's worst fears about Stalin's brutality. And then, the Warsaw Rising in 1944. The Red Army literally stopped its advance and watched as the Nazis crushed the Polish resistance. To the West, this looks like a completely cynical and calculated move. And here's the key takeaway for anyone studying this period. The Second Front wasn't just a military debate. From Stalin's point of view, the constant delays were proof that his so-called allies actually wanted the Soviet Union to bleed itself dry fighting Hitler, so it would be weaker after the war. That suspicion just poisoned everything. Which brings us to our next point. As it started to look like victory over Hitler was actually going to happen, the Allies' focus began to shift. They started planning for the post-war world. But they weren't planning for a world of peace and cooperation. No, they were planning for a world of conflict with each other. And honestly, nothing proves this more clearly than a secret back-of-an-envelope deal that Winston Churchill himself nicknamed the Naughty Document. I mean, just look at this. This is the Percentages Agreement from October 1944. Churchill and Stalin sat down in Moscow,
and literally scribbled on a piece of paper how they were going to carve up Eastern Europe. Romania, 90% Soviet. Greece, 90% British. Hungary, 50-50. This isn't an alliance built on shared values. This is a cold, cynical, backroom deal between two empires getting ready to run the post-war world. And you have to understand, while Stalin was making these deals on paper, his actions on the ground were telling the real story. At the exact same time, late 1944, the Red Army was marching back into the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and swallowing them up. It showed he had absolutely every intention of building a wall of Soviet-controlled states in Eastern Europe, no matter what his allies said or thought.
So, how did we get from them being allies to becoming bitter adversaries? When you lay out all the evidence, the collapse of the Grand Alliance starts to feel less like a shock and more, well, inevitable.
Let's just quickly retrace the steps. 1. It started with a total ideological opposition that created a deep foundation of mistrust. 2. It was only ever a marriage of convenience to defeat Hitler. 3. The big wartime disagreements proved their goals for the future were totally different. And 4. Their so-called post-war planning was really just them preparing for the next conflict.
Which leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. They worked together to defeat fascism, which was an absolutely incredible achievement. But with such deep mistrust, and with such completely opposite visions for what the world should look like, you have to ask, was the battle for a peaceful future already lost before the final shot of World War II was even fired?